Hello and welcome. In this course, we're going to be building a full stack application using React, TypeScript, Material UI, AWS, CDK, AppSync, and Cognito. The app will have a fully managed authentication system where you'll be able to create an account and then use that account to sign in to your application. And then as an authenticated user, you'll be able to make calls to your AWS AppSync API, as well as integrating with the Google Books API. On this explore page, we use the Apollo GraphQL library to connect to the Google Books REST API, and we're able to search for books on that API with a debouncer on this search bar. And once these books come up, we're able to then also use pagination on the Google Books API, and then we can add these books to our bookshelf, which will hit our AWS AppSync API using GraphQL. If we go to our bookshelf, we're able to view these in different categories. We have a reading column, a to read and finished column. We're able to favorite these in real time, which updates it on the database. We have a menu to be able to change the status of them. We can move them to finished or move them back to reading. We can also delete books from our bookshelf. And we've also got pagination on this as well. If we click on view more on one of these, we'll be presented with a modal, and we can click on read more, which will open up a new tab and give us a little preview of what the book's about directly on the Google Books website. As well as that, I'm going to be showing you how to structure your project so that you can work in a scalable manner. We'll also be using AWS CDK with TypeScript, which will show you how to use AWS AppSync in a very easy yet scalable way. This course is packed with tips and tricks that you may not already be aware of and will really help you take your application to the next level. So stay tuned and let's begin. The first thing you want to install is Node.js. So just go ahead and type in Node.js in Google. You can go to their download page and just go ahead and click the recommended for most users. If you want the latest and greatest, then you can go ahead and download the latest version, but most companies won't be using that as it takes some time to get widely adopted. So going for the recommended version is probably the best option for most people. Once that's downloaded, go ahead and install that onto your PC. You'll get an installation window like this. Just go through the installation. Click agree and install it. Once it's done, you can close it. I'm just going to quit this and reopen my terminal, and now I should be able to run node-v, and it will print out the version of Node that I have installed. And that confirms to me that I've successfully installed Node. The next thing we want to install is the AWS CLI. So we're just going to type in AWS CLI in Google. We can go to this link here, install, update the latest. Actually, let's just go from this page and let's do getting started. And if we go over to get started, we can go to install. Just scroll down to Mac OS or the operating system that you're running on. Just scroll down. This is the GUI installer. What we want to use is this one right here. And to paste that in here. Obviously for my password, and continues the installation. I already have the AWS CLI installed, so for me it said the upgrade was successful, but for you, it should say something like the installation was successful. And here it shows us what we can run in order to verify that it's been installed correctly. So let's just run which AWS. As you can see, it's been installed in user local bin AWS, which is correct. And let's just check the AWS version. So now we've confirmed that AWS CLI has been installed. Next up is the AWS CDK CLI. We're going to go on the main page after I've typed in AWS CDK CLI. As you can see here, it's as simple as running npm install -g AWS CDK. It's failed for me and asked me to try to install it using sudo instead. So I'm going to run sudo npm install -g AWS CDK. This may or may not happen for you. And as you can see, it's completed. For me, it was an update rather than install, but it should be a similar process. So now I can do CDK-version and it will give me the CDK version. So now I have Node, AWS CLI, and CDK CLI all installed on this PC. The last thing we need to install is Yarn, the package manager, which is what we're going to be using to build our application. We'll go over to the Yarn getting started page. I'm going over to installation. You can see that it's saying as of version 16.10. You can use Callpack to do this. So what we're going to run is do Callpack enable, and then we can scroll down to here and do Callpack prepare yarn stable activate. Now we should have Yarn available for us to use. As you can see, we now have Yarn installed. This is the first time I've actually done this. If this doesn't work for you, you can always try to do npm install -g yarn, and that should also install Yarn for you the traditional way. If you're following the course, don't do this just yet. But at this point, you should be able to create Vite applications using Yarn. All you need to do is type in yarn create Vite, and this will kick off an installer for you. You'll be prompted with a project name. So if you gave it a name, Vite Project, and then selected your language, I'm just going to select React here, click on TypeScript, and that has created a project for me. That's everything we need to install, but before we go, we do need to set up our AWS environment so that we can use it for our project. In order to do this, we want to go over to AWS and log into our account. So once you've logged into your AWS account, head over to the IAM Identity Center and make sure you select a region that you are comfortable with working in. I'm going to be working in Europe Ireland. You can only have this enabled in one region, so make sure you select the right one. Then you see here that you've got this enable button. You click on enable and you can click create AWS organization. Let's just go into users. We're going to click on add a user, and here I'm just going to give my username there as written, generate a one-time password, and I'm just going to fill these fields out as they're asking me to. Once I fill that out, I can click on next. Then when we get to this page, it's going to ask us to add a group. I'm just going to click on create a group. I'm going to call this group admin group, and our group has been created. So if we go back here, let's just click refresh, click on admin group. So we can add ourselves to the admin group, and then scroll down all the way to the bottom and click on add user. This will now show me that I can log into this portal with my username and my one-time password. So I'm just going to go ahead and log in. My username was Redwan, and my one-time password can be copied over. It'll prompt me for a new password, so I'll just put in a new password for myself and set the new password. And as you can see right now, it says I don't have any applications because I don't have access to anything in this account. But let's go back to our group and go ahead and go over to permission sets, and then click on create permission set. And we're going to select predefined permission set because we just want to give administrator access, so we have access to everything. I'm going to click next, and click create. And now we have this permission set called administrator access. Next, we want to go to AWS accounts and then click assign users or groups. We need to select an account first, assign users or groups, select the admin group, click next, and then select the permission set administrator access, and then click next and click submit. Now what it's doing, it's configuring the access for this account, and now the account has administrator access. So if we go back to the page where we just logged in before, refresh this page, you can see that we have access to this AWS account. And if I click on this, I can go into the management console or command line program. So what we're going to do is go to our command line and then do AWS configure SSO. The SSO name is just going to be called SSO. The start URL is going to be this URL here. I'm going to copy this. You can also find this in the dashboard right here. on this. The region is going to be EU West 1. That's my region. And this, I can leave it as default. It will show a pop-up trying to log into the account. And I'm just going to click allow here. And it's granting access. Done now. I can close that. Now it's saying CLI default client, EU West 1. I'm going to agree with that. Output format, so you can set that to JSON. Profile name. Pause right there. This isn't going to be my official default account. If you want this to be your default account that you're always using all the time, then set the profile name to default. But I'm going to be leaving it like this because I already have a default account that I'm using that isn't this account. Okay, back to the video. It's giving me a profile name, administrator access, and I'm just going to save that. And now it's telling me to use the profile, specify the profile name using -- profile as shown. I'm just going to run this now. And you can see that it's using this account to list the S3 buckets on my account. So if I go over to S3 in AWS, I should see that bucket listed out there. You can see that. So I'm going to go to my repos folder, repos, and in here, I'm going to make it for bookshelf-CDK, and then I'm going to CD into that. I'm just going to copy this, and within here we're going to put CDK init at -- language TypeScript, and this should create our CDK application for us. Now that's complete, what we're going to do is open up this folder in Visual Studio Code. Now we should have our folder up and ready. As you can see, we've got a package.json, we've bookshelf.cdk name, we've got a cdk.json, which has app to point to our bin/bookshelf-cdk.ts. We go and look in there. We see that there is a template in here already. So what we're going to do is on comment already. We can also open up the lib folder, and we can see that there is an example stack in here for us as well. So the first thing we should do is just run a yarn in here so that we can install all the required files. Once that's done, we should have our node modules folder installed, and those complaints should go away. In the bookshelf-cdk file, we need to uncomment this line here, and this will use our details from our command line that we've already installed. And then let's go in here and delete this code. We can actually delete all the rest of this code as well. So in here, what we're going to add in is our Cognito User Pool. The way we're going to do that is just going to do Cognito equals new user pool, which we can import from the lib/AWS Cognito. In here, we'll have this. And in here, we'll have the configuration for our user pool. So what we want for this application is going to be self sign up. We're going to set that to true. We're going to have sign in aliases, which will be email true and username false. This is so that they have to use their email addresses to log in and not their usernames. This will be the standard attributes that we will have on this Cognito pool. So we want email to be required, given names to be required and mutable, family name to be required and mutable also. We then want to set the password policy, which will be minimum length of 8 and some other criteria to meet. And the last two things we want to add is account recovery and removal policy. We want them to only be able to recover their accounts with email only, and the removal policy is going to be destroy. Just going to add these imports from AWS CDK lib and AWS Cognito. This is going to be our construct for our user pool. Next, we want to create our user pool client. So we're just going to import this, and our client is going to set the user pool to the Cognito construct that we just created here. It's going to use the user password flow and user SRP. We're just going to set generate secret to false, and we also want to use OAuth with the authorization code grant flow. And in these scopes, and this is all we're going to need for now. And we're going to set our callback URL to localhost 3000 because we're only going to be using this in development. We're not publishing this or anything yet. Great. So the last thing we want to do is output these by doing new CFN output. I'm going to import this from here, AWS CDK lib. and we will output the user pool ID as well as the user pool client ID. So if we go ahead and save that, now we can go ahead and run CDK deploy, try and deploy our application. And that has been successfully deployed, and it's output our user pool client ID and our user pool ID to us so that we can use in our front end application. We can also go into AWS and go to Cognito in order to see a Cognito pool being created. We can see here bookshelf user pool. If I go into here, we can see user pool name, the ARN, the user pool ID, AKCDO. If we just look at that, AKCDO, that's the one that's just been created inside AWS. That's pretty much all we need to do on the backend in order to get our Cognito set up. So the next thing we need to do is create our front-end application. So I'm just going to cd out of this, yarn create Vite. It'll ask me for a project name. I'm going to name it bookshelf, and I'm going to select React. And then for the variant, I'm going to select TypeScript, and it's now created a Vite project for me. So I'm just going to go cd bookshelf yarn as it's telling me to do so. But I won't run yarn dev just now. We'll open it up in Visual Studio Code in order to do that. I'm just going to do code. In here, we can see our project has been set up. We've got a vite config.ts, a yarn lock, a package.json, index.html, as well as our source folder with our main file. I'm going to open up a terminal in here and run yarn dev. Seems the package doesn't seem to be present in my lock file. I need to run a yarn install, so I'm just going to run a yarn install in here. I think this is to do with my new version of yarn I've actually just installed. That's fine, we'll just wait for this to complete, and that's now done. So let's try and run yarn dev again. And as we can see, it's running on localhost 5173. I don't actually want it to do that, so what we're going to do is go to vite config and add in server port 3000. I'm going to save that, and now the server should have restarted and gone to localhost 3000, and we can see here that it's now loaded our application and it's got a counter and some stuff. Cool. So the first one we're going to install is .env as a dev dependency, and we should see that now this has been installed. So what we can do is add a new file, and this file is going to be .env, and within our .env file we're going to define 3 variables, which is going to be region, user pool ID, and user pool app client ID. In here, we're going to set this to EU West 1. Our user pool ID we can get from here, and our user pool client app ID we can get from here also. So let's save that. And then we go into our vite.config file, import the .env config, and define our process.env. It's asking us to install types node, so let's go ahead and do that as well. Add types node. Now the error's gone away. This should give us access to environment variables within our Vite application. So if I go into app.tsx and type in console.log, we should be able to see our environment outputted here. So now you can see that we have access to environment variables in our application. So let's go ahead and install the other packages that we're going to be needing, which is yarn add at AWS-amplify/UI-react, AWS-amplify. Whilst that's installing, I'm also going to be just grabbing the material UI installation command. So I'm going to install this, yarn add material UI. And then we also need the icons. We're going to add as icons. In order to get the icons working, we also need to add one more config in here. Optimize depths to include the MUI icons material, and save that. Now let's go to our main.tsx file, import amplify, amplify.configure, auth. Region is going to be process.env. Let's just grab all these 3 things that we need in here. user pool ID, and user pool web client ID. And then I'm just going to paste in our values like that. And we should have Amplify configured. Now we can import our authenticator provider from AWS Amplify. Provider and wrap it around our app. And then we can start deleting some stuff from our app. Let's just delete index.css, delete app.css, remove this, remove this. Let's remove all of this. I'm just going to do bookshelf. Let's just have that in here for now. Get rid of this. And let's get rid of all of this. I'm just going to change this into a const because I prefer like that. Get rid of this as well for now. Okay, so now if we go back to here, we should just see this is now what our app looks like. So what we're going to be wrapping our app in is the authenticator from AWS Amplify. If we save that, yes, it's giving us a login. We want to also import the style.css from UI React. And now we can see that this is up and ready for us to use. So we've got this set up. So let's try and create an account here. So I'm just gonna copy an email, just a password for me. And as you can see, it's complaining, saying that it did not conform to the schema. Given name attribute is required, family name is required. So both these things are required, and we set that up within our CDK stack. As you can see here, we get a given name and family name property of required, and that's why this is complaining. So now we're going to look at how we can customize the screen, make it suited for our needs. So first thing we're going to do is create a new folder called components. And within this folder, we'll create another folder called core. And within core, we will create a component called authenticator.tsx. Authenticator is going to take in props with children. We're going to import from React, and then we will return something here. And that should stop complaining. But what we actually want to do is move over from using this authenticator here and move this into here. And instead of calling it authenticator, we're going to say as Amplify Authenticator, and we'll put that here like this. And this one, we can now import this from our components folder. So everything should still work exactly the same. Nothing has changed. We can refresh. We're still right here. However, the next two things we want to import are the Amplify theme provider and theme. So we'll just save that, and we'll wrap the whole application in the Amplify theme provider. This will allow us to customize the theme on the authenticator component. In here, you can see that this takes in a theme, and let's just declare our theme by doing theme, which requires a name, and we're just going to call this bookshelf. And that's all it needs really. So just set that to theme. Let's check that everything's still working. Everything looks good. Now we can start to customize what this is going to look like. So before we start working on the actual styling itself, what we want to add is some configuration to the Amplify Authenticator itself. I want to change the variation to modal, and I want to add in these sign up attributes also. If I hit save on that, we can see that now this has changed into a modal instead of just being fixed page. And if we just refresh the page, we can see that if we go to create account, we can now also enter in given name and family name. This still looks quite wrong though, because we don't want the user to be able to type in username, or we want them to enter in their email every time. And I don't really like the wording of given name and family name. I prefer first name and last name. So we'll also go ahead and change that. And the way we'll do that is by adding in form fields into here. So for form fields, we can pass in the values for the sign-in page, and we can change username to use the label email instead, and placeholder is changed as well. Same thing goes for the sign-up page. We can change the label and placeholder for each of these different fields. So I'll go ahead and save that. I'm just going to refresh the page. We can see that now this asks for an email address. email, password, confirm password, first name and last name. I'm going to try and create that account again. I just click create account. Now it's sent an email to this email address asking to confirm. So if I go and check the email, we can see that we've got an email come in with a verification code. Go back to our app, paste that in, confirm. And as you can see now, we've logged in and it's signed in. If we inspect and go to application, go to local storage, we can see that we've got some access tokens and other things being stored in here. Those are user's identity, different type of things like that. This user is now authenticated. Actually, we need a way to sign out. So what we're going to do is we're just going to add in a link here, or let's just add a button from Material UI. And the way we can log out is by using the useAuthenticator hook, which we can import from UI React like this. And we can see we'll add an on click to this, which will be sign out. We can use the user detail to put in user information. I'll just leave that for now. So if we can go here, we can see the logout button, and if we just click logout, then it clears the application and the user is no longer authenticated, and we can try and sign back in if we need to. So now let's go ahead and style this to make it look a little bit nicer. If we go over to Authenticator, what I'm going to look at is the components property, which basically allows me to declare a bunch of different components that's available in this authenticator, like the footer, the header, sign in, sign up, and I can completely replace them with my own components. For now, I'm just going to do the header. I'm going to import box from Material UI, as well as typography. I'm going to create a typography with a variant H4 for my title. And my box is just going to be a box with rounded edges, some padding, a background color of black, and being centered in the middle. I save that. Now we've got this bookshelf header on top of the existing modal, and I'm going to do something similar for the footer. Will allow me to have a bit of a bottom border here as well. So now I've got a rounded box instead. Now we can go ahead and start customizing our theme. I think it's worth mentioning that the Amplify Authenticator has some documentation around this, and you can always refer back to this in order to do some more learning and find some details on how to do the theming in here with values on how their theme actually works. So as you can see, there's this object called tokens, which you can overwrite and change the colors and the components. That's what we're going to be using today. You can also use override as well, which completely overrides different components, but we don't want to be using that today. We're just going to be using the tokens to try and make it as consistent as possible across all the different components within the authenticator. We're going to look at tokens and the colors that should be. Within colors, we want to set the primary and secondary colors. So the way we do that is by expanding brand, and then within brand, I'm going to set them to these colors. So these colors that we have here are colors that are already being provided by Amplify. As you can see here, if we go to colors down here, they have a list of all the different colors that they have available. I'm using overlay for my primary color and neutral for my secondary color. There's a reason I've made 90 and 100 both black, and I'll explain that in a second once we get to it. So just changing those alone, you can see that it's already looking a lot better. It's starting just to feel a bit more like my theme. But this still doesn't look like exactly how I want it to look, so I want to drill down a little bit further and modify it even more. I also want to change the font color for secondary, which is going to be, I'm going to set it to my primary color of 90, which is black, and that's going to make this color a bit darker, make it black. The reason I'm using secondary here is because I've actually inspected this and figured out that secondary is the value that affects these colors, and that's why I'm using that. You can also just inspect these yourself to see what values are being used. You can see here Amplify label is using field label color, which points to Amplify colors font secondary. So that's how I know it's using the secondary. So if I change that to this color. Now you can see now it's set that to black, which is the color I've set the secondary color. Next thing I wanted to do is change the radius of these buttons and inputs. For that, I'm going to add in a configuration for the radii, and I'm going to set small to value of 0.75 rem. And now you can see it's added a little bit of border radius to my input, which fits a bit more to my theme of what I want. There's also here medium, XL, XS, different values. And same as before, you need to figure out which ones are using which things. Now we've kind of set already the main premise and the global styles for everything in here. We need to narrow down really on all the different little bits that we want to change. So in order to do that, we want to access the components property on tokens. So on here, we have access to a range of different components that make up the authenticator component. So the first thing we're going to look at is the authenticator itself. I'm going to change the modal background to the value of blue 40. So if we look at that, now the background's been changed. The next thing I want to do is get rid of this border around this box here. So for this, I'm going to change router to border width of value 0. You can see now that border is gone, already looking a lot cleaner. The other thing I want to change is the color of the tabs whilst it's inactive. You can see it's kind of like this off-white grayish color, and I just want it to be black when it's not selected. For some reason, saying the inactive state of Authenticator is the only way to do this. I'm going to set it like that, and as you can see now, it's completely black when it's not being selected. Don't worry, we'll fix this as well. Now we're done with the Authenticator, we can move on to looking at tabs. We are kind of limited here to what we can do. As you can see here, state inactive. For the authenticator, I've had to access this in order to do this. I wasn't able to set this in tabs because there are different components overwriting different things. Again, if you want to rewrite it completely yourself, then you have the option to override the components in here and have your own custom components completely. But for the sake of this video, we're just looking at how we can style it and modify it a little bit without giving ourselves too much work and having to manage too much code. So within tabs, we want to access the item property, and then for the item, I want to set the border color and the color to black and white. Now if we have a look at that, that's looking a little bit better, but we can see it's still behaving a bit weird when we're hovering over it and when it's selected. We don't really want it to look like that. It doesn't look great. I don't like how this white is clashing with this. So I'm going to access these other properties, which I can access in here, which are the active, focus, and hover properties. So for active, I'm going to set the background color and border color. So the background color will be black, color will be white, and border color will be kind of white. So now we can see when I've selected it, it's still black. It's just got the border on it, and we can switch between these like that. So when you've selected it, it still has like focus on it, and that's why it remains black. And this happens both when you hover over it or you have focus on it. So we're going to set the focus and hover to secondary 40 as well, which is more like a grayish white. And if we go back to here, we can see that now we've got sign in and create account, and that looks a lot better. So let's go ahead and sign into our app, and our app is still looking like this. I am just going to show quickly how we can use user to put out the user's name. So to do this, I'm just going to add in a stack from Material UI and set the direction to row, and I'm going to do justify content space between. I'm going to change this into a link. Get rid of the button. I don't need the variant. Just going to set the color to primary for now. Let's have another stack. Just justify the content on this end, and we can add in typography. We want to user.username. We'll do user.attributes.given name like that. And as we can see here, we've got the title and we've got go on and log out. We can just get this a little bit of a spacing as well. You can see we can log out and we can log back in. We can also obviously add in the surname here as well. by using family name. And as you can see there, it's come up. In our main.tsx file, what we're going to do is add in our theme provider for Material UI. And then we need to create a file called theme.tsx. In here, we need to create a theme object and export that theme object. We need to import this from Material UI. And then in here, we can just set our default color palette. For me, I'm going to set the primary to be black and the secondary to be white. I'm also adding in a background color, which is a bit of a gray. I'm going to go back to my main.tsx file and import this. Also, not to forget, we also just need to add in the CSS baseline right on top of the app component. So this is what our app currently looks like now. We've basically just got a stack from Material UI that is in direction of row with bookshelf, and we have another stack at the end to output the user name and family name, as well as having the logout link. So we're going to get started by creating the header component first. For this, let's go over to our core folder and add in a new file called header.tsx. And within here, we're going to define header, and then we can export header from this file. For this, we're going to be returning an app bar from Material UI. Going to import that from Material UI. We'll set the position to static so that it's fixed at the top of the site. The color is primary and elevation will be set to 0. Now that we've got this, we're just going to head over to app.tsx. Let's just get rid of the content in here and we'll bring in our header.tsx. Get rid of this now. Let's delete all of this. You can see there's nothing in the app right now. So let's go ahead and start adding in some content. First thing I want to add in is a container, which I will import from Material UI. And then I'm going to set a max width of XL. And then within this container, I'm going to create a stack. Import this, and within the stack, the first item I want, which is the top bar, is going to be a box, which is essentially just a div, and this will be imported from Material UI again. I'm going to set the display to flex, add justified content for space between so that the content is separated apart, and align the items in the center. I'm also adding in a padding top for when media query is at MD or lower. So this is for mobile devices. We're going to be adding a padding top of 2. And then the first thing I'm going to add in here is the typography for the bookshelf itself. So I'm setting this variant to H4 and I'm adding in font weight and font family to this header. So if we go ahead and save that, we can now see that something's showing up on the web page. After this, I'm going to add in a stack with direction row and alignment towards the end. And then within this stack, we'll put in our user detail and the sign out button. So first, let's add in our authenticator again. So we'll use the user authenticator hook to get the user and the sign out properties. And then within here, we're going to add in a typography, which will say if there is a user, we can output user attributes given name plus a space and the user attributes family name. We can see that now this is being rendered. I'm then going to add in a separator followed by a link, which will import from Material UI, which will allow the user to sign out. Now you can see we've got an app header with the username and last name, and the user is able to sign out as well. We can see that this is functioning. We can sign back in and you can see this is working. The next thing we're going to add in is after the box, we're going to be adding in a toolbar from Material UI, and in here we're just going to add in a disable gutters. This should give us a section here below our initial header, and then within here we want to add in the 2 buttons that we're going to be using for navigation. So what I'm going to be doing for now is I'm going to create a constant called pages, and within these pages I'm just going to set it to have 2 strings. One's going to be called explore and the second one is going to be called my bookshelf. And then for the buttons, I'm going to create a component within here called header button. Header button will be imported from Material UI, and I will create a interface for header button props, which will take in path name and children. This button will take in a path name, and the path name will be compared to the current location in the browser, and based off of that we'll know whether the button is actually active or not. And if the button is active, we're going to set the color to black and set the background color to white, and we'll do something similar for the hovering effect. We will also change the variant from contained to text if the button is not active. This we're going to be using the secondary color, setting it to full width and disabling the elevation. So now down here in the toolbar, what I'm going to do is iterate through pages. So I'm just going to do pages.map page, and then within here I can have in header button, which will take in a key of page, and path name will be just page for now, and let's just add in page in here also for the page name. Now we can see we've got two buttons. We can't actually make any of them selected because we haven't implemented the navigation yet, but you can see I can try and click on these. I can highlight over them and I can click on them. These are my two pages that I'm going to be adding to my navigation. Before we start adding in the navigation, I want to now add the support for mobile. As we can see, if we change this to a mobile view right now, it still works, but it's not great. It's not the best. So what we're going to do is import an icon for the menu, and then just before the bookshelf here, we're going to create a box which will house an icon button, and then the icon button will have a menu inside it. Save this and go back. We can see that now we've got this button here, but we only want this button to show up if the user is actually on a mobile phone. So the way we're going to do that is by adding in to the box style properties, and we're going to set display to be an object, and then within this object we can set XS to have a different value. So when the user's display is in the XS mode, we'll change it to flex, and if it's MD, then we're just going to change it to none, so then it won't appear if it's MD or higher. So now you can see we can't see it there anymore, but if we go into mobile, we can see that it's actually there, like that. So we're going to be using the same method to change up the rest of the look of this header. For these two typographies, I'm just going to be setting them to XS to not show in XS, and then have inline otherwise. So I don't want to show them. This will come up looking like this, which is a little bit cleaner. And I'm also going to do the same for this entire bottom row. So now we can see that in mobile view, it's only going to show up like this. Otherwise, that's not quite right. So we don't want it to be like that. We want it to be flex. So let's just go back, and that seems to be better. Much better. Cool. So now we've got it looking quite right. We just need to set it up so that we can actually use this menu when we are on the mobile site. So the way we're going to be doing that is using a dialog. So let's create another component called navigation menu full screen CSX. So in here we'll create the props, which will be navigation menu props. I'll take in open, handle, close, and pages. This is just going to be a string for now. This will change later, and we can declare our component, which is then going to return a dialog from material UI. Dialog will have several properties on it to make it full screen, set to open, and to handle the closing. We're also going to be adding in a transition which is also from material UI, so that we can make it slide up in the application. And let's just import all of these and add in a transition component set to transition in here. We're then going to add in an app bar to sit at the top of this dialog. This app bar will just have a toolbox with an icon button, which will be a closed icon, which we can import from material UI. This will allow us to close down the dialog and then also have a title. We will then add in a list underneath this toolbar, which we can import from material UI. And this will render a list of divs, which will have a list item button inside it. Also within the list item button, we will render list item text, and we'll also have a divider at the bottom of it to just separate out all of these buttons. We can then create a handle navigate function, which will just close this for now, and this is what will be used on click for this button. So in our header component, we'll add some state management logic in here. So we have a state variable called open nav. We can use the setup nav and two functions, handle open nav and handle close nav, which just basically set these to true and false. And then right at the top above the app bar, we can add in our component, which we've just created. Let's just pull that in from there. I'm expecting us to put in pages like this. If we save that, just get the linting, and then we can use the handle open nav with our icon button here. So let's do on click handle open nav. Now if we go back to our application and we click on this, we can see that this is loading up the navigation, but the buttons don't look quite right, and that's because we put the list inside the app bar. What we want to do is put it outside of the app bar. Just save that, go back. We can see that now we've got this outside of the app bar, and we can use these to close down the menu. We don't have access to the menu on the desktop. Now we've got the UI all done. Let's add in our router logic. We're going to install React Router DOM by doing yarn add React Router DOM. And then from React Router DOM, I'm going to import browser router as router from React Router DOM. And then I'm going to wrap the app around the router. And then within our app file, what we want to do is change this into a fragment so we can have our roots in here. So roots will be imported from React Router DOM. Within our roots, we're going to create a root element which will have a path of nothing, but for the element we're just going to set this to an empty div for now. And then in here we want to add in our different roots within root. So for our first root, we're going to have a root that will have an index property, which will mean this is the main element shown at this index, and we're just going to set that to, let's just say, explore page for now. And then under this we'll have another root which will have a path of bookshelf. This will have an element of bookshelf page. So what we actually need to set up here is an element that will have an outlet to these two roots. So what we need to do is in core create another file called layout.tsx, and in this file we're just going to create a simple component with some breadcrumbs in it. So the layout component is going to have a container and have some breadcrumbs, and what we want to put inside this at the bottom is an outlet which we're going to import from React Router DOM. This will allow us to render things that we are putting inside this root on the main page. So let's change this from the two divs to a layout component like this. And now let's go here. We can see it's rendering bookshelf and explore page. This is because we have bookshelf in here. So I'm just going to change this to breadcrumbs in here. Like that. And we can see we haven't got navigation working on this quite just yet. But if we change this to bookshelf, we can see that we're navigating to a different page. Okay, so the way that we're going to be organizing our roots is by creating a folder called util, and then within this folder we're going to be creating a file called root.ts, and then in here I'm going to be declaring an interface called page, and page is going to have a path and a name. Then I'm going to declare two strings, which will be the path for explore path and the bookshelf path. And then I'm going to declare two pages, which is of type this, and each one will have their own path. So explore page will contain the path for the explore path, and the name is going to be explore. Similarly with the bookshelf page, it has the bookshelf path and the name is going to be my bookshelf. I'm also going to create a helper method in here. So I'm going to import useLocation from React Router DOM, which will allow me to get the path name that I'm currently at. So if I'm on /bookshelf, this will give me /bookshelf. And then I have a function which I am switching between the different paths to find the page for that path. And then I return the page and the path as an object. So this hook use current page, I can then use this inside our layout component. So if I go in here, I can have use current page in here like this, and then I can use this here to output the name of the page that we're currently on in the breadcrumbs. So now I can remove this from here. Now that I've got my roots set up, I can go back to my app.tsx file. I'm going to change this to the explore path, and change this to the bookshelf path. Now you can see when I'm on /bookshelf, it's saying bookshelf/bookshelf and it has bookshelf page. If I change this to the home page, it will say /explore page. If we go to our header component, one way of allowing us to navigate using our buttons is to change the button to a link that we can import from React Router DOM. Let's just add link back in here for the other one. So if we change this to a router link, we'd have to remove all of this, but we could have a to and have path name on there like this. This would allow us to navigate to the things just by using these links. But I want to retain my styling, so I don't want to use it like this. I want to use a button instead. So I'm not going to be doing this. Instead, we're going to be programmatically navigating between our pages. And the way we're going to do that is by using a useNavigate hook, which is imported from React Router DOM. And we can use this navigate hook by doing onClick navigate to path name. Now you can see it's navigating between these two pages programmatically. So the reason this isn't correctly set up is these pages are using these fixed values. We want to be using the pages that we've defined in our routes. So I'm going to be importing explore page and bookshelf page, and now pages has changed into an array of pages. So I need to also change this everywhere I've been using it. So in here, page.path would be better, and path name is also going to be path. And then for the name of it, it's actually going to be name. And then we need to also change this in here. So instead of a list of strings, it's going to be a list of pages. I'm going to import from routes. Again here, this will be path. The text will be name and the navigation will be path. And we can use the same thing we're using in here, which is navigate from React Router DOM. So if I import this hook, I can use navigate and navigate to path. So if I remove this, I can see that now actually this is working and it's correctly highlighting that I'm on the explore page. And if I click on bookshelf, it's correctly highlighting that I'm on bookshelf page. I've gone to /bookshelf. The breadcrumbs from my layout is rendering as bookshelf/my bookshelf, and I can navigate between these two. In the last video, we left the bookshelf application looking like this, where we had navigation and we could navigate between the two tabs. This time we'll be picking up in the bookshelf CDK repository. We're just going to come into our bookshelf CDK stack and scroll down to underneath the user pool client. And then here we're just going to be creating a new GraphQL API, which we can import from AWS AppSync. And this is how the setup is going to look like. We're going to have a name, a schema, which will point to GraphQL/schema.graphql. And then our authorization config is going to have a default authorization, which we're going to set the authorization type to authorization type, user pool. And we're going to have a user pool config, which will take in our Cognito user pool as the property of this object. We will then add in additional authorization modes to include an object that has an authorization type of API key. And the API key config will just contain the name, the description, and expiration, which we can import from CDK. We can then add in some CFN outputs for our GraphQL URL as well as our API key. This will output these values when we do a CDK deploy so that we can then use those values in our front-end application. So next we want to create our schema file. So let's go ahead and create a folder called GraphQL. And within this folder, we're going to create a new file called schema.graphql. And then within our GraphQL file, we can define our types, which looks like this. We have a book type with things such as ID, title, authors, and so on. And then we also have a type of image link and an enum of book status, which fits into the book type respectively. Now we can carry on defining our schema in here, but I want to show you a trick on how you can do this easily using the tools that AppSync has provided on the AWS console. Once you're in the console, you can go over to AWS AppSync. Then in here, go ahead and click Create API. We're just going to select GraphQL APIs to begin with, and then select Design from Scratch. And here you can just add in a name for your API. It doesn't really matter. It's just for us to test things. We're going to be creating our own one later. And if you just go through that step, you can click Edit Schema. We're going to be using this tool here to generate the resources that we need for our GraphQL schema. So if we go back to our code, there's a couple of things we need to do here first, which is basically this tool can only support one type at a time. So we need to remove the image links and book status properties from our type. So we're just going to go ahead and comment them out from the book type, and then we can copy them and go back to the console where we can click on create resources. This has a custom type in here already, but we're just going to overwrite that with our book type. And as you can see here, it's created a book table from our type up there. So we're just going to add some numbers to it just to make it unique. But if we scroll down here, you can see that it's showing us what it's going to be creating. However, it doesn't let us copy here. As you can see, if I try to copy and paste, it doesn't let me. So what we're going to do is just scroll down all the way to the end and click on create. And this is going to go ahead and actually create a DynamoDB table and create a GraphQL API for me. But once that is completed, then I've got this code here, which I can then actually just copy and take back into our code. And I'm just going to go ahead and paste that underneath the code that we've already got here. There's a couple changes that we still need to make. So our image links and book status, we need to bring that back in. We can remove this book here as well. And let's just uncomment these two properties. And we're just going to have to manually add these in to the different parts. As you can see here, it's created a book connection, which is what we're going to be returning from our list. And then it's created an input as well for creating a book input. This is also missing the input type for our image links. So we're just going to add that in here. And then we can add our two properties in the input object as well. And then if we can keep scrolling down, you can see we've got an input for delete book input, and we've got these filter inputs as well, which is what we can use to do filtering on the query. However, I don't think we're going to be using all of these. This is going to be added into the list books query. It's also created a bunch of these table book filter input types. And you can see here the ID is using table ID filter input, and then the other ones are using table string filter input as well as table boolean filter input. And it's using all of these different variables that you can use on a DynamoDB scan or query. But it's also created some additional ones in here that you can see that we don't actually use. So we can go ahead and remove those. We currently do have a boolean one, so let's just keep that in. We have an ID one. We don't have an int one, so let's delete that. And then if you scroll down here, you can see that we've also got a subscription object, which will allow us to subscribe to events on the API, but we're not going to need this for this video, so let's just go ahead and delete it. The last two things we have in here are the type mutation and type query, which contains all of our different mutations that we've created, as well as the different queries that we have in this schema. And that's our whole schema defined. This is all we're going to be needing for the rest of the video. So now we can go ahead and start taking a look at how we can create some resolvers for our mutations and queries. So now make sure this is still pointing to your schema file. And we're going to come down here and define our books DynamoDB table. We can import table from AWS DynamoDB, and attribute string is also from the same library. Now we've got our books table. We can go ahead and create our DynamoDB data source, which is created off the back of our GraphQL API object and takes in the books table as an argument. So our first resolver, which is getBook, is going to be using the ID getBook, and it's going to have type name of query and a field name of getBook, which should match our query from the schema. We can just import this mapping template from AWS AppSync. And finally, our data source is going to be our book DS that we've just created above here. So just come back to our mapping templates. If you look at what we've got in here, it's a VTL file in this location. So we need to create this. So let's go ahead and create a new folder called VTL inside GraphQL. And let's create a file called dynamo get item request.vtl. VTL is essentially what we're going to be using to interface with DynamoDB. So we could try and learn how to write VTL here, but AppSync has already provided some very useful resources for us in this situation. As you can see on this dummy one that we created earlier, we've already got all of these resolvers here. So if we search for query, you should see getBook comes up with this resolver here. So if we click into this and you scroll down, you can see it's already given us a mapping template. And it's also got a list of different templates that you can use here. So you could come back to this and use this as a base to build out your VTL templates. So let's just go ahead and copy this and paste it into our request get item file. So basically what this template does, it stands for Velocity Templating Language. It's just a way for us to interface with DynamoDB. As you can see, there is an operation as well as the key, which is something that's required by get item here. And as you can see here, ID is using util, which is a function made available to us by AWS AppSync. And it's using .dynamodb with this toDynamoDB JSON function. And this is something that we can find in that library. If you go to the AWS AppSync documentation, you can see that there is a whole section around the VTL files and the different things that's made available to you. So utility helpers is something that we can use to get things, as you can see in here, util.parsejson, as well as AutoID, which is a function that automatically generates a unique identifier for us. You can go through this documentation if you want to find out more about what you can do with these. Next, we need to create the Dynamo response VTL. We're going to be using the same one for each of them. So let's create a new file called dynamo response.vtl. And this is what we're going to copy and paste into there. That's all that we're going to need. And we're going to be using that for all of the different resolvers that we create. Next, we'll create our list books resolver, which will look like this. It's pretty much the same as the get one, but we need to create a new Dynamo list item VTL file. So let's go ahead and create that. And then let's go back to schema and search for query again. And this time we can go over to list books. And then we're just going to copy in the resolver from there. As you can see here, the operation is scan, and we've got a filter property on it. This has an if statement that checks if we have a filter in the arguments, and then we use a transform function to transform the filter into the required format for DynamoDB. And then the limit just defaults to null, otherwise 20. So our default limit is going to be 20 for this query. And then we also have a next token, which is used by DynamoDB to return further results if we're using pagination. For the response of this resolver, you can see we're still using the same Dynamo response VTL we used before. Next, we'll create our create book resolver. This has got an ID of create book. This time the type name is mutation. The field name is create book, and the other things look very similar. We need to create a Dynamo create item VTL response. So we'll create a file for that. And we'll do the same thing in here. We'll go back to schema, and then in here we'll search for mutation this time. And then we'll just copy over the request template. And here you can see the operation is put item. We've got a key of the ID that we want to create. It's using an auto ID from util, which auto generates the key for us. And the attributes value are the things that we're going to be passing in from the front end. And there's also a condition in here to check that if this already exists, then we don't want to create that again. So there is one change that we need to make to our schema, and that's the change I created at and updated that to AWS datetime, because these aren't going to be strings. We're going to be creating this from within our resolvers. And we want to go ahead and remove this from the filter input as well, as we're not going to be filtering by this. We can remove some of the other stuff in here as well that we're not going to be filtering by. And from the create book input, we can remove the dates as well. And let's just remove that from the update input as well. This is because we don't want us to have to send in the created and updated values from the front end. We want these to just happen automatically every time a new item is being created or updated. So I'm going to show you how we can do that within our resolvers using this VTL template as well. At the top of our create item template, we're going to add these 3 lines, which first is going to set a created variable to util time now ISO, which is going to create a time for us. And then we're going to use this util QR, which basically just silences whatever's within the bracket to set the variable of created at to the value of the created at variable that we created. And this will add in those 2 properties to the object that we're passing into DynamoDB, so that when the item is created, we've got both a created at and an updated at property populated in that object. Next, we want to add in the update book resolver, and we need to create a VTL template for this as well. And then we'll go back to schema, search for mutation again, and this time click on update book, and then we'll select all of this and paste it. This looks a little bit more complicated this time, but it's actually not too complicated. To give you a basic understanding of this file, it's setting up some variables that it's going to use, and then it starts to iterate through all the different arguments that's passed in from the front end, apart from the ID, to check whether it needs to be removed or updated. Then it starts to actually create the expression, adding in all the different properties that it's going to update, followed by all the new properties that it's going to add into this document. And then it goes on to continuing writing the expression for all the properties it's going to remove. And then finally, it prepares the update expression ready to be sent to DynamoDB. And it also has a condition to check whether this ID actually exists or not. We also want to add in our updated at logic in this file as well. This time we won't be updating the created at, obviously, because this is an update. So we'll add this in at the top, and that should be everything we need for the update. Next, we can create our resolver for our delete mutation. It looks like pretty much exactly the same. Field name is delete book this time, and then we just need to create a retail template for this. And as you probably guessed, we're going to go back to AppSync and search for mutation. And this time click on delete book, and we can just copy and paste this into the file. This time the operation is delete item, and as you can see, it's just requiring an argument of input with a value of ID. And that's all of our resolvers created, and we're done with updating our CDK code. So let's go ahead and deploy this code now using CDK deploy. I'm going to ask you whether you wish to deploy the changes. Just type in Y for yes. You should create and deploy your changes. And once that's done, you can see that we've got two new outputs. One is the API key and the other one is the API URL. So now if we go back to the AWS console, we can see that our new books GraphQL API has been created. And if we go inside here, we can go and click on schema. We've got the entire schema that we created in here. We can go to data sources and we can see our book table data source. And then we can go down to this queries place where we can actually play around with the API that we've just created. But in order to do that, we first need to log in with our credentials. So if we click on login with user pool, we can click on the drop down to select our client ID that we created. We can then fill out the details for a user that we've already created with our Cognito User Pool. If you haven't done this already, then make sure to go check out the other video where we create our Cognito User Pool and create users with it. If you already have a Cognito User Pool, you can also just go into your Cognito User Pool and create a user directly within the AWS console as well. You can see that now we are logged in. And on the left here, you can see the different queries that we have. Like, for example, there's books, and we can see all the different properties that's on here. So if we select this and try to query it, you can see it's coming back with no items, but it's still successfully making a query. So let's go ahead and try and create a book here so that we can actually get something back. So if I click on mutation, then click on this plus button, it will add it beneath the query section. And if we just expand create book and select title, so these are all the different things I can provide in the input, but I'm only going to provide the required ones, the one with the star next to them. So title, publisher, and publish date. So I'm just going to put in anything here, test book. For publisher, I'll put in Ridwan, and for publish date, I'll just put in a random date. And then click run my mutation, and we can see that that was successful, and it returned the ID back to me as well. Now I'm going to try and list out the books again. So if I run list books, you can see that it's come back with the ID, but if I add in some of the other properties as well and run that again, we can see that it's come back with that book that I've just created. So we can see that our API is actually working. So now let's install Apollo GraphQL on our front-end application and get it hooked up with our GraphQL backend API. So there's a few different packages we'll be using to do this. I'll add these packages in the description down below so you can just copy and paste it into your terminal and install them. So let's go ahead and install these now. Once we have this installed, we want to head over to our .env file. We want to add these two properties in GraphQL endpoint and GraphQL API key. We can copy this from the deployment that we did on our backend service. So I'm just going to copy those over now. Once we've done that, we can save it and create a new file called codegen.ts. To start off with, let's export an empty object. And then within this object, we're going to create a schema object, which is an array. This is where we can tell the code generator where to get our GraphQL schema from. So the first object is going to be our AppSync endpoint. So we're going to have the URL in here as a string. That's going to be imported from our environment variables. And that's going to have an object with headers X API key and our API key. This will have the necessary authentication in order for us to get our schema from AWS. We also have a second item in here, which is just a string that points to any file in this location that is a GraphQL file, which means we can also have local GraphQL files to extend our schema, which will help us when we come to looking at integrating with the Google Books API later on. But now let's go ahead and create this path by creating a new folder called API. And within this folder, we'll create another folder called GraphQL. Next up in our file is our documents object, which is an array again. This is telling CodeGen which documents to consider. So things like queries and mutations that fall within this path, but isn't generated.ts. Next will be some hooks. This is just a hook we want to run when we run the script, and we're just telling it to prettify our generated file for us. Next, we're going to tell it what to generate for us. So we want to generate a file called generated.ts. And the config is that we want to include hooks in it as well as refetch functions. And then we're going to be using these three plugins also to help us achieve this. The last thing we want is just to add in ignore no documents to true, which helps make the watch experience a little better. Now let's go to our package JSON and add in these two scripts. CodeGen, which is going to be using mcmd-f, which will use our environment files to run the GraphQL CodeGen script, and CodeGen watch will just run the previous script with the watch flag. So let's go ahead and run yarn CodeGen into our terminal. Okay, so I've missed installing mcmd, so I'm just going to install this now. Then we're going to try running yarn CodeGen again. And you can see it's generated some output. So if we go over to generated.ts now, we can see that this has produced all of the types that we had on our backend, and it's created this in our front end application so that we can use it with our React app. So now instead of having to manually create all of your types locally, you can just reference everything from this file directly. One thing we've missed is the AWS datetime scalars. You can see that the input and output are set to any. So to fix this, we're going to come into the config here and add in the scalars property, which we can custom define what they should be. We don't actually need all these other AWS ones, so we're just going to remove it and just keep the AWS datetime set to a date type. So now if I run yarn CodeGen again and go back to generated, you can see that that's been updated to types of dates. If it wasn't clear about what I just did, one thing to make sure that you never do is to actually edit the generated file directly. If there's a problem in your generated file, then there's probably a problem in the way you've set up your schemas or your configs. So always try and fix those and then run yarn CodeGen again to fix your generated file. Now we can start building our queries on the front end. So let's create a new folder called fragments. In here, let's create a new file called book.ts where we can have our book fragment. We need to import GraphQL from Apollo client, and we're just going to describe all the different properties that we want to get back from our AWS AppSync backend. Let's create another folder called queries and a folder called mutations. Within queries, we want to create listbooks.ts where we can define our listbooks query. We'll import GraphQL from Apollo client again. Listbooks is our internal name that we use on the front end application, so it could be anything. However, listbooks here is the query name from the API, so it needs to match the backend, as well as all of these properties that it's expecting on the backend as well. And we are using a fragment to return our book item in the list of items that we're returning in listbooks. And if you go inside the fragment, you can see that that's the fragment we created earlier, and it should be returning all these different properties that we've listed in there. So now let's create our files for our different mutations, which is going to be createbook.ts, updatebook.ts, and deletebook.ts. The create book mutation will look like this with mutation in the end, and we're just going to call it create book, and it's going to take in the create book input, and obviously it will point to create book on the back end as well. Please note that this variable is using a $sign, and it should match the variable that's being passed in with the $sign on the inner query as well. Where it says input, this can be any name you want it to be. However, the one on the left hand side which says input should match the one on the server like we've got here, create book input. So if this was something else like arguments, that should also be matched on the front end here. It should say arguments instead of input. So let's add in a mutation for update book mutation, which is going to be very similar to create. We'll point to update instead. Then let's do the same for delete, which is exactly the same and just pointing to delete instead. So now let's go ahead and run yarn CodeGen again. Now this time when we're going to the generated file, we'll be able to see things like use delete book mutation, use delete book mutation, update book, and these are the functions that is now being generated from our query and mutation files that we'll be able to use with Apollo to actually make queries to the backend. Next, let's create an index.ts file, and in here we'll just export all of these in case we need any of these exports elsewhere. And then we'll create a new file called make_apollo_client.ts. In this file, we'll be setting up the configuration for our Apollo client that we'll be using for our application. So we need to create a middleware. This is what it's going to look like. So we import set context from Apollo client link context and all from AWS Amplify. And basically, we're just creating this middleware so that we can get the current session from AWS Amplify, which will allow us to get the access token and then get the JWT token for that. And then we can just put that onto the authorization header as an interception to our network request. Then we need to create the HTTP link to point our Apollo client to our AppSync API, and we'll import this from Apollo client, and you can see that the URI is being set to the GraphQL endpoint from our global environment variables. And then we can link the auth middleware to this GraphQL link that we've just created. And finally, we will create the client from Apollo client and import this in-memory cache from Apollo client as well. And we'll use the link that we've just created. Now we can set up the Apollo provider in our main.tsx file. In here, we'll just add in Apollo provider with the client that we've just created. So we can import that from the make Apollo client file. And now that we have that installed, I can give you an example of how to use these hooks to interact with your API. So our app.tsx file currently looks like this, but let's clean it up a little bit. Let's go ahead and create a new folder called pages. And within here, we want to just create another folder called bookshelf, and let's add another folder to pages called home. Within bookshelf, we want to add a new file called bookshelf.tsx, where we will just export a component that just returns a simple text. And then we can replace this component in here with the component that we've just created. So import bookshelf from our pages. And then let's copy and paste the bookshelf component and call it home. And we'll just do the same thing here. Now we can replace this one for the home component as well and import it from pages. At this point, our app should be looking and working exactly how it was before. As you can see, we can still navigate and it's showing the two different components. Now let's go back in and start using our hooks. So if we're going to the bookshelf component, we can start using the hook by doing const data loading error equals use list books query, which is provided to us from Apollo and given to us in the generated file when we did yarn codegen. And basically what this will do is actually make the query for us, and it gives us access to these values such as data, loading, and error to manage the state for this query. So let me just console.log the values here and I can show you what is coming up. So if we go into the console, we can see that there's object false coming up. Let's just go to the network tab and look at the actual request. We can see that this is hitting our API endpoint and our payload is list books with our GraphQL query. And then if we go into preview, we can see that data is returning list books with items, and this is the item that we created within the AWS console. Okay, yeah, now it's actually loading on the console as well. As you can see, that's how that's working. And it's as easy as that for us to make calls to our API library. So it takes a little bit of setup, but once we've got it running on the front end, our code is so much nicer and cleaner. And that's not even touching on all the caching capabilities that is provided to us through this. So just for the sake of it, let me show you how to actually call the mutation as well. So to do this, let's just make a quick UI and I'll create a button called create. And then to use the create book mutation, we're going to do const create book, which will be our function that we're going to call. And then we're also going to have all the different properties that we had in the query one as well. This time we're doing use create book mutation, and then we can import that from our generated file. So let me go ahead and show you what these loading states are actually doing. So if I just do an if statement here, if loading, return a loading div. So we'll do if loading or create book loading, then we'll return that loading ... I can show you that if I change this to slow 3G and then just refresh the page, we can see that loading text actually show up. just before it switches over to rendering the button. So that's what the loading state provided from the hook is doing for us. So now let's go ahead and create a function for creating a book. I'm just going to populate these with some values so that we can just test this right now. So in here, I'm going to call await create book with variables, and the input is going to look like this with a title, publish date, and author name. Then I'll just close this off. Actually, I don't need the result, so I can remove it. And I'm just going to add in a refetch function to the query as well. This is why we added in with refetch function to our code gen. And then at the end of this function, we just want to call refetch to load the original list books query again. This isn't the right property. I just need to change this to publisher, and then we can set our on click to handle create book, and we'll just list out our book items here so that we can see what we've got coming back from the API. So now if we go here, we can see test book is being rendered already. That's the one we created before. And if I click create book, it's doing loading again, and then once it's done, it's showing my book, which is the one I just created on the back end. So I could also use the data that comes back from create book to do different things with it, as well as handling the error state and things like that. So this is what our app currently looks like at the moment. We can navigate between these two tabs. We've got React Router DOM working. In the last video, we set up our backend GraphQL endpoint, and now we can create books and get books back. So to get started with the Google Books API, what we're going to do is we're going to head over to Google Cloud API Library. And in here, the first thing we want to do is create a project. Just going to click on create new project, and I'm going to give this a name of bookshelf and click create. So now it's creating that bookshelf project for me. And once that's done, we can go ahead and select that project. It'll take us into this page here. Don't need to worry about any of these. We just want to go ahead and search for the Books API. And you can see here, Marketplace, it comes up Books API. So I'm going to click on that. And then I'm going to click Enable. This will enable the Books API for me. And this is completely free, so we won't have to pay anything for this API at all. Cool. So now we've got this API enabled. I need to create some credentials so that we can use. So let's go ahead and create some credentials. Here we'll just select public data so that we can create an API key. Click on next, and then it will give us an API key. So let's copy this API key and go into our .env file. And here we want to add in a new variable called Google API key, and we're going to store that in there. We're also going to need the Google Books API URL, so we'll add that in here too. Now that we've got these two things set up, we want to hook this into our existing Apollo GraphQL architecture. So in order to do this, we're going to create a new file called typedefs.graphql, and in here we're just going to create some types for everything we're going to get back from that Google Books API. And the types are going to look like this. So we'll have a Google book type, which will have an ID and a volume info, and the volume info will have title, authors, publisher, publish date, and so on. And you can see here we've also got image links, which extends into here. And then we've got this type search books, which returns the total items, the kind, and a list of Google books, which is what we've got up here. And then we just want to extend the type of query from what we already have to include search Google books. And these are the different parameters that this query is going to take in. So now we can create a query for this. So I'm just going to call this search books.ts. And in here, we're going to be starting off very similarly as we did with the other queries. So we'll have a query named search Google Books query, and then we'll have a query of search Google Books, which will take in the query, the API key, and a start index. And then the query that we're going to be hitting is the search Google Books query, which is coming from what we named it in here. And you can see this is also taking in the different parameters. So this is when it starts to get a little bit different. We're going to be adding in the @rest directive to this query. And in here, we're going to say what the type is, which is search books, which is matching what we've called it in here. And then we will also want to add a path, which is going to be the query string that gets appended onto this REST query. So this is how we are constructing our request. So it's going to be using a query string of Q, and then it's going to get these properties from the args object. So you can see here Q equals args.query, key equals args.api key, and so on. And then the rest of our query will be very familiar, as we're just going to be adding in the properties that we want to get back. However, we do need to add in the type directive on each of these objects as well, just to link them up to those new types that we created, such as Google Book volume info, and Google Book image links. So now let's save that and go into our index file and also export the new query that we've just created. And then what we can do is try and do a yarn code gen to generate a new query. I hadn't saved this file, so I'm just going to save here. And now that should have worked. So now if I go into generated and search for search books, we can see that this has come up. And let's look for our query. We can see we've got a use search books query in here that we can now use in the same manner that we're doing with all of our GraphQL endpoints with AWS AppSync. So if we go into our home component, let's create a new state variable called search, and let's import new state from React. And then let's use our query that we can import from our generated file. We'll talk more about fetch more later on, but at the moment what we've got is we've got these variables that we're going to be passing in. The query is going to be our search state. The API key is going to be coming from our end file, and we're just going to have our start index at 0. And as this will be running on the initial render, we can just console log out the data at the moment right now and see how that works. So if I open up the console, let's just refresh the page, look at the network tab. We can see that we are actually making the right call with the right query. However, it's going to the wrong URL. This is hitting our AppSync API URL, and we don't want it to hit that URL. We want it to hit the Google Books API URL. So the way we're going to do that is by going into our Make Apollo client file. And in here, we want to add in a new REST link, which will point to our Google Books API. And we want to import REST link from Apollo link REST. And then we also want to include this here by doing from, which will come from the Apollo client. And then we want to have REST link and link within this array. Let's go ahead and save that and then run yarn code gen again. We also just need to restart our server. I seem to be having some issues with my browser. I'm just going to restart my server again. Okay, cool. That seems to be working now. And if I go to here, we can see that now it's actually hitting the correct API and it's come back with a 200. Let's have a look at the preview. We can see the items have come back with a bunch of different books. If we open volume info, we can see there's effective JavaScript and so on. Let's just go to the console. We can see now that we do have those results coming back. We're successfully hitting the Google Books API. So now let's start building out our landing page and start making it look a little bit better. The first component we're going to make is a page title. So let's go to components and create a new folder called common. And in here, let's create a new file. Let's call it page title. And this is going to be a very simple component. We're just going to import typography from Material UI, taking a title, and we're just going to output that title in a H4. This is so that we can reuse this again in the future. So let's go back to our home page, and then let's change this into a fragment. And inside our fragment, let's have a page title. We're going to import from common, and we're just going to call this page the explore page. So that should look like this now. So we can have explore coming up. So we've got a title on our page. Next thing we're going to do is create another file called home.style.tsx, where we can create some styled components so that we can use those in our home component. And the one we're going to be starting off with is a search bar, which is just going to be a styled outline input from Material UI, but we'll give it a border of 1 pixel solid main color. We'll give it a small border radius as well as some padding. If we go ahead and save that, we can now add in a search bar here. We'll import this search bar from our home.style. It has an ID of search bar, a placeholder of search. The value is going to be search, and we want to also import a search icon, which I'm going to import from Material UI icons. It's also going to be full width. And now I just need to create a handle search function, which is going to look like this. I'm just going to handle search and set search like this. So now it should look like this, and I have a search bar, and I should be able to make multiple queries here. So if I change this to Harry Potter, you can see that now that's come back with some data, And if we go into here, we can check. Yes, we've got a fantastic piece book. But as you saw, this wasn't very efficient, as every single character that I typed in made a request. So that's not good. So let's go ahead and fix that. And the way we'll do that is by installing a library called useDebounce. So if you go ahead and install that, we can then import this useDebounce hook from useDebounce. Then we can add in a new line here for the useDebounce on search to give us the debounce value. And what this basically does is it waits 500 milliseconds before actually updating this value with whatever is in this value. So now instead of the query being search, we can change it to debounce value, which will give us a bit of a nicer experience when we're searching for something. So I've been trying to use the new Arc browser because I like some of the new features it was offering, but it turns out it's giving me a lot of issues whilst I'm developing. So I'm just switching over to Brave. Hopefully this won't cause us the same issues we were finding over there. So just to prove this point a bit further, I'm just going to set this back to search, and I'm going to change it to the network tab so we can watch what's going on in here. And I'm going to type in Harry Potter. And as you can see, for every single character I'm typing in, Harry, PP, PD is already made a request for each of those. So let's change that to using the debounce value now. And now when I type something in, it'll wait for me to finish typing and give me 500 milliseconds after I finish typing to make that request. And as you can see, that's a lot nicer. We only get one request once the user's finished typing, and we'll still get back the results that we need, which is awesome. Cool. So let's carry on. The next thing I just want to add in here is a divider, just so that we can separate the search bar from the results. So here, let's create a box, which is going to have a display grid, and then we'll have the display template columns to have a minimum of 250 pixels and fill up as many as it can with a gap of 2. We'll just import box from Material UI, and then within here we can loop through our data. So if we do data.search Google Books items, as you can see, that's not very semantically pleasing. So what we're going to do is just create a new variable here called books, and we'll use a use memo, and we'll extract the books from the data using this use memo. And anytime it changes, and only when it changes, books will be updated. And we can also avoid having to deal with data coming back as null, as we can just coalesce it into a empty array. So instead of data, we're just going to do books here .map, and then within here we can say Google Book, which we can import from generated. And for now, let's just output something simple like the book title. We'll do volume info dot title. In here, it seems to be complaining about the different types. So what we're going to do here is actually change this up a little bit. We'll just change this to war, and then have as Google Book array in here. And now this should stop complaining. So let's go ahead and save that. And as you can see, now it's listing out all the different books that is being returned by the API. So now what we want to do is within the common folder, we're going to create a book card component, which is going to be accompanied by a book card.style.csx as well. With this component, we're going to create 3 different style components. First one's going to be a card, which we'll call styled card. It's going to have a minimum width and a maximum width with a border radius, and then we're going to set the display flex with a flex direction of column. We will also have content, which will import from card content as content, just to have a height of 100%. And the card actions will be imported as actions, which we're just adding a justified content space between into. So let's save that. And our book card is going to look like this. So we're going to have the bookshelf card props, which will take in a book, which comes from the generated file. We're going to set an image height, as well as the card content and card actions, which are just going to be React nodes, so we can pass in anything for those. The reason we're building like this is so that when we end up building up the bookshelf page as well, we can reuse this component again later. So the book card will take in these properties, and in here we will use styled card and card content and card actions from our style file, and the entire card will be wrapped in the style card. We'll have a card media, which is a component of type image, and we'll set the image height to whatever has been passed in, otherwise it'll be 200. And then for the image, we'll look inside the image links to try and select the small thumbnail, and if that's not available, we'll select thumbnail, and if that's not available, we'll point it to a notebook image.png. So you can see that I haven't put a path here, and this is because this image is going to live inside the public folder. So I'm just going to put this image here, and if for any reason there is no image linked to this book, then it will just show that image instead. So the alt will be the book title, and we just have an SX on here to set the padding top to 2 and set the object fit to contain. Card content will contain card content, and card actions will contain card actions, and we're also going to disable spacing on that card actions as well. So let's go ahead and save that, and then we're just going to go over to home, and we're going to create a component in here called Google Book Card. And for this, we're going to start off with something a little bit basic. We're just going to have a props of Google Book, which will be what we're taking into here. And then we're going to import this book card from the other component that we just created. As you can see, we're taking in book, image height, card content, and card actions. So to get the Google Book type to be the book type that we created on our backend APIs, we need to do a little bit of mapping on our end so that they can match. The way we're going to do that is by deconstructing the ID and volume info from the Google Book, and then recreating that as one object for the book that we pass into the book card. So I'm just going to import that as well. And then for the card content here, we want to add in a stack and start building out what this card is going to look like. To be honest, the first thing I want to add is a title, but I think this can also be a common component. So I'm just going to create a new component called card title.tsx, and this is just going to be a styled component of typography with some styling to make it look a little bit better. So if we go back to here, we can add in our card title, which will have the value of book.title. And then we can also add in some other information here, like the authors, the publisher, and the published date. So authors is an array, so we're just going to grab the first one and display that. And if any of these don't have the values for any reason, we're just going to display a little dash. As for the card action, I'm just going to add in something in here for now, and we'll come back to it in a second. So let's try and actually use this Google Book card that we've created instead of just rendering the title here like this. So I'm going to import this Google Book card, and it's going to take in a Google Book, which is just going to be the book here. And we also just want a key, so I'll set this to book.id. Let's go ahead and save that. And now if we go to our app, we can see that we are rendering these cards with the books and the images. We could search for something else, and you can see these are now being rendered as you'd expect it to. So now let's go back in and deal with the card actions. So for the card action, I actually want to use a loading button from Miri Lab, which we don't actually have yet. So I'm going to add in this package, yarn add Miri Lab. Once that's installed, I should have access to loading button from Miri Lab. I'm just going to call this add to bookshelf. And there's a few different props I want to add to this. I want to set it to full width. I want to have a start icon of bookmark add, which I can import from Miri icons. And I'm also going to have these two properties, loading indicator and loading. So whilst it's loading, it's going to say adding, and then if this is true, then this button will be disabled. So what we need to do here is actually give this button some functionality so that these two things can work. So in the last video, what we did was we used this create book mutation just as an example, but now we're actually going to be using it for real inside our Google Book card. So if I paste this in here, and I'm going to change this to add to bookshelf, but I'm not going to care about any of the results. All I really want is loading here. So I'm going to put loading, and I'm going to import this from the generated file, and then I can save that. Now I have my onClick function, which is coming from this, and the loading state will be also coming from this. However, in the other component, we actually used the create book function and pass in the variables into here. But there's another way for us to do this, and we could just pass in the variables straight away because we're not waiting on anything to change to receive those variables. So what we can do is within the options in here, we can add in the variables to create our book. So everything we're going to add in is going to come from this Google book object that we have. And I'm just going to import book status here. Well, actually, it's complaining about ID because we don't actually need ID in here because ID will be auto-generated. So if we get rid of that, then these are all the different properties that we're going to be saving into our own database. So if we go back to the browser, we can see that our books have come up. Now we have these buttons underneath everything. So if we go ahead and select something here like this, it should say adding. You can see that was loading. And then now if we go to my bookshelf and just refresh this page, looks like it's potentially complaining about this. So I'm just going to change this into more thumbnail. Go ahead and save that. And let's just try again. We hit add to bookshelf. And now we can see that that has worked. So for some reason, it didn't like us just mixing and matching those types, even though they're basically exactly the same. But that's fine. We've just updated that now. So now if we go over to bookshelf, we can see that this book has also been added into our bookshelf. Let's find another book to add. Let's add JavaScript and jQuery. That gets added. Let's go to my bookshelf and refresh. JavaScript and jQuery has also been added. So we can see that this is persisting our data into the database as well. However, there is something else that's not quite right. As you can see, when things are loading, we are just seeing a blank screen. So if we refresh the page, we see that blank screen. So what we want to do is create some skeletons for the loading of these cards. I'm going to create a new file called Google book list skeleton, and in this file we're going to have this component, which is going to be a grid from Material UI. We're going to define a new array with 12 items and map over those. The item doesn't really matter, and within that grid we're going to have xs equals 12, sm equals 6, and so on, just so that we have something a little bit consistent. And then with those, we're basically just trying to recreate our card with some of these skeletons. So we have a paper with a border, we have a stack, and then we have a box with a height of 300 to mimic that image. And the skeleton is going to be rectangular with a fixed width and height. And then we'll just have some text skeletons below that with some additional fixed width and height, as well as a rounded one at the end to match that button. So if I save that now, I can go to the home component, and just in here what we'll do is we'll say if it's loading, we will show the Google book list skeleton component. Otherwise we'll show this component like that. Now if we save that and go back to the application and just refresh the page, we can see, okay, let me just add in a slow 3G so that we can actually see it in action. Let's refresh the page. Now we can see how these are loading. Another way to see this is to just set this to true so that you can work with it and edit it. As you can see, we've got a skeleton, it's pulsing. It looks like the card that is going to render once it's done. So that's pretty neat. So let's undo that. So now that's working quite nice, and we've integrated with Google Books API. So there is a bit of a more advanced topic I wanted to cover as well, which was how to do the pagination and load more. So there is quite a neat way of doing this with Apollo GraphQL. And this is why we added in this fetch more option as well. So unfortunately, the fetch more option doesn't actually affect the original loading state. So we need to manage our own loading state for that. So we're going to create a new state variable called fetching more, and we'll have it set to false to begin with. And what we basically want is a function to handle fetching more, which is going to set the fetching more to true and then await fetch more, which is this function, and passing those values again, whichever value we are. But this time, instead of the start index being 0, it's going to use the books.length as a start index. And then once that's done, we can do set fetching more to false. I'm going to create a button at the end here, another loading button, which is going to be handling the fetching more for me. As you can see, the loading state that it's using is fetching more, and it's going to be disabled if the books.length is the search Google Books total items. We've seen in the API that when we get the data back, we also get total items. So if we already loaded 1700 items, then the load more item would be disabled and we can't load anymore. I'm just going to save that. And if we scroll all the way down to the bottom and click on our load more button, we can see that it's loading and then it comes back with some further items. However, none of our items here have been updated, and although we've got additional data, we can't actually view it on our page. So what we actually need to do is we need to update the Apollo cache to actually recognize this data. So when we make queries using Apollo stores them in a cache locally. So if you install the Apollo GraphQL extension, you'll be able to see all the queries that your app has made. And if you go into cache, you can see all the different things that have been cached into this application. We've got a search Google Books query, and that's the original query that we did. And then we've also got a second one that's had the start index of 10. So this is our second set of data, but you can see they should actually just be one set of data, not two. There's actually something that we can do in order to make that merge happen. And that is by providing an update query into our fetch more option. So our update query will take in our previous result that was handled. The update query will allow us to use the previous result that we had and our current result. And basically in here, what we're doing is we're checking if there are no more new results, then we just return the previous result. Otherwise, we want to extract all the items out of the previous results and also all the items out of the new results. So I'm calling this previous books for the old ones and more books for the new ones. And if we do have new results, then I'm setting the new results to an array of the previous books and the new books. So I'm just concatenating the two arrays, and then I return that new array into this update query function so that instead of having two queries, I only want one query. And we can also move this set fetching more inside this function as well, so that just before it finishes doing that, it can set the loading to false. So if I save that now and go back to here, I'm just going to refresh the page and set no throttling, and then let's go back down here. And we can see in here, we've got cache of search books. We've got 10 items. And if I go down here and click load more, you can see that now it's actually loading in all these extra books and I can view all of them. And my search Google Books cache remains as one query. And if I expand this, we can see now that this has 20 items and I can keep doing this and I can keep loading more. And it's just updating the cache for me automatically. And as you can see, this is going up. In the last video, we left off with the explore page complete. We're able to load in different books, and we're also able to view some information about them and also add them to our bookshelf. Once we add them to our bookshelf, we are hitting our AppSync API endpoint, and we are returning those books back from the server. We also have a button here for creating new books, which we don't need anymore because now we're using these add to bookshelf buttons to actually add them to the bookshelf. So let's get started in building out our bookshelf. We'll head over to our code and go to the bookshelf component. And in here, we can remove the create book mutation as we're not going to need that anymore. And let's get rid of that button that we created for it as well. And this time, instead of doing our logic within the bookshelf component itself, we're actually going to be using a custom hook. So to do this, we're going to create a new folder called hooks. And within that folder, we'll create a file called useBookshelf. And in here, we'll create a function called useBookshelf, which is for now just going to return an empty object. And this is how we're going to be defining our custom hook. And what we want to do is move this query inside of the hook. So I'm just going to move this inside here for now. And to start off with, I'm just going to return all of these from the hook like this. Let's just import this as well, and we'll save that. So now in our bookshelf component, instead of starting to have those logic there, what we'll do is instead we'll get all the data that we need from our custom hook. So let's just do data and loading, which will be from use bookshelf. Now we can get rid of all of these, and as you can see, this still works the same way as it did before. We're just now using this custom hook to load in our data instead of getting it directly from here. Cool. So in the last video, when we did the logic for creating the book mutation, we set the status to book status.onRead as default, and the status of the books are going to be up to the user to manage, to say whether they are currently reading this book, they haven't read it yet, or they've finished reading it. So when we're displaying this to the user, we also want to separate out these books into these different categories. So in order to do that, we're going to create a new value called books, and we're going to be using useMemo to do this. So let's just import useMemo from React, and let's import book as well as book status. And basically what we're doing here is we are looking at the data that's returned back from our listbooks query. Obviously there is the listbooks query item and the items, and we're filtering out all the books that are of type book status reading, and we're putting that into a value called reading. So in the end, we end up with books, which has 3 different properties on it that will have their respective books in. Now we no longer need to return data from here, and what we'll do is return books instead. We can also remove these 2 from here, as we don't really need these at the moment. And if we go back to bookshelf, we can now change this to books, and instead of going to use books.items, for now we're just going to say books.onRead, which is basically going to be all of our books for now. And you can see this isn't actually rendering all of them, so I wonder if that's because we didn't set book status on some of them. So if let's just load this data in again, we've got 3 books here. 2 of those books are test book and my book, and we can see we haven't got a status on them, so they've been filtered out. We can also update this logic to include those null values as well. So if we just add this to here for the onRead one and we save that, now we can see that we've also got this test book and my book coming up in here as well. But I'm not going to use that just because I want to filter out those bad data from my results anyway, so we'll just keep it like this for now. And then what I'm going to add in are the 2 other mutations that we created for the books, which come from update book and delete book. So we're just going to import these in. So we'll now have access to these 2 methods, update book and delete book, and these 2 loading variables as well. So let's just expose the loading from this hook for now, and let's create some handlers for updating and deleting the books. We'll create a function called handle update book, which will take in an object of update book status, and as you can see, it's complaining about the fact that status isn't on the update book input, and that's something that we actually need to change on our API. So if we go into our bookshelf CDK repository and scroll down to the update book input, you can see we didn't add in the status on here. So I'm actually just going to get the status from here and include this into the update book input and save that. Now if I do a CDK deploy, I should be able to push those changes to my GraphQL endpoint and then be able to pull that back down in my CodeGen files. Now that's done, let's go back to our bookshelf repository, and I'm just going to run yarn CodeGen again. We should get the latest schema down, and that should include status in there for us. So now if let's just go into here, we can see status has now been added. So let's go back. This error should go away by itself, and now we can expose this method as well. Now let's add in a handler for the delete book. The delete book is just going to take in an ID, and we'll use that in the variables for deleting the book. So let's expose this as well now. Now you can see our hook really starting to take shape. We are getting in all the different data that we need, and the different handling methods are in here as well. So now that we've got these, let's go and start building out our UI with the data that we've gotten back. I'm just going to copy all of these and paste them in here so we can get all of that data back that we will need. Let's get rid of this for now and start building it out. First thing we're going to do is add in a stack with a space between, and we're going to import the stack from material UI and page title that we used in the home component as well. This one we're going to be naming it my bookshelf. Let's just go and see how that looks. Yes, now we've got our title the same as we do on our explore page. And then we want to start creating these containers for displaying our books. So the first thing we'll do is just create a stack with spacing of 1 for now. And then let's go ahead and create a new file called bookshelf tabs, as well as a new file called bookshelf.style.tsx. Create our style components. And the two that we're going to need right now is the category container and the tabs header. These will just be styled boxes with border and border radius, and the tabs header is just going to have a solid border bottom. We're going to start off with this component. We have a props interface of tabs, which is an object of any name pointing to a React node, and then also taking in the books count. So basically we're saying there is a name attached to another React component, and we're going to be using these to show the different tabs. We have a stock handled tab management here. Just going to rename this to tab and set tab, and we'll just name this tab as well, and then we can use value equals tab here. So that makes a little bit more sense about what this code is doing. And then we're using that category container that we just created, as well as the tabs header. And then within that, we just have a stack with a direction of row and a justified content of space in between. We then have our tabs, which is imported from material UI. And this is the component that is being handled by these properties here. So we can use those to change which tab we're on. And the way we're displaying the tabs is by doing an object keys on the tabs object, which will give us an array of all the different property names in there. And then we're basically mapping over that to return a tab, which has a key of index, and the label is the tab name, which is the name of the property from the object. And then underneath the header, what we want to have is a box which has a display flex, and it's going to be justified at the end. We just have a typography to display the total books count for that specific category. And then last but certainly not least, the actual content of the tab itself. So this time, instead of doing object.keys, we're doing object.values on the tabs to get those components that we're passing in, and it's going to use the current tab to be displayed within this box of role tab panel. You can also see here that we have hidden set to tab does not equal index. So if the current index isn't being set, then that tab will be hidden from the view. So to see this in action, let's go to the bookshelf component and add in our bookshelf tabs, which we can import from bookshelf tabs. And the books count is going to be an array of the unread books length. And let's change this to unread and import book. Now, if we go back to our app, we can see that we've got a container. It has the total books showing in the corner, as well as the tabs. We don't have any other tabs on this, but we can see that our component that we've created in here is also being rendered right next to each other. So let's now go and create our bookshelf cards. So I'm going to create a bookshelf card component, and this is going to look like this. Right now we have a bookshelf card props, which is going to take in book, and it's also going to take in handle update book, which has an input of the update book input from our GraphQL schema. And then the bookshelf card itself is going to have a handler for handling updated book favorite, which will take in the ID for the book and set the favorite to the opposite of what it currently is. And here we are reusing this book card component that we created in the last episode, and we're passing in the book here. We don't need to spread it like we did in the Google book card, because this is now the correct type that we're expecting. The card content is just going to use the card title again that we created so that we could reuse a typography of the first author in the list. And then in the card actions, we're just going to have a favorite icon button, which will set our book to being a favorite if we click on it. And these are using the two icons, favorite and favorite border from Material UI. If it is a favorite, then the color will be of type error, which is basically just red. Otherwise it will just have an outline. So if we now use this instead of what we've currently got right now in here, just set that to bookshelf card and import it. We can set book to this book, and also we can set handle update book to handle update book from our hook. And now you can see these are rendering down here like this, and we can also favorite them, and that should make a request to the backend. We can see it's called the update book, and it's returned the data, and now favorite is now true. So if we refresh the page, we can see it's still set to favorite whilst the others aren't. Next, let's create the book details dialog, and this will be a dialog that we can import from Material UI. So the props for this component will be handle close, and the handle close will pass in as a function that we can use to actually close this dialog. And in here we're using the use theme hook from Material UI as well, so that we can get the breakpoints for the media query. And basically what this is basically saying that if it's lower than MD, which I believe is about 900 pixels, we'll have full screen set to true, so that the dialog will take up the entire screen rather than just being contained within the center. The max width of this dialog is medium as well. We're just going to have open fixed for now. There is another way of doing this as well, where you pass in open into here and then set open from the value that you're passing in, but I usually tend to avoid that method, just because if you're editing things inside the dialog, then you can end up in the situation where you're opening the dialog with different data and it's still retaining some data from the old one. So I'm going to be showing you a different way of handling that. Unclose just uses the handle close function that's being passed in, and then we have set the paper props to have an SX of border radius 25 pixels. We'll start off with a stack of direction row. And basically what we want is to have some data on the left and an image on the right. So I'm going to create two boxes, which I'll import from Material UI. And the first box is going to have a few different properties on it. It's going to have a display of flex with direction column and justify content space between. The width of this, however, is going to be 70%, and the width of my second box is going to be 30%. However, it's going to have a height of 100% also. And within the second box, I'm just going to have an image with a source from book image links, same as we did in the Google book card, with a small thumbnail and either one of these. And if it doesn't have an image, it will just default to our notebook image, and we'll set the width and height to 100%, and the style will have an object fit of cover. So that will be our image display, and then within our content we'll have a few different things, starting off with a dialog title, which will just be the book title itself, and then within the dialog content we'll have a stack which will contain dialog content text, and in here let's just import all of these missing attributes. And inside the content text we're going to have a div which is just taking the description, and we're taking the first 500 characters from the description and appending it with a ... just because if the description is too long we don't want to include the whole thing in there. And beneath that we'll have a link that will redirect you to either the preview link or the info link. Otherwise it will just default to nothing, but I should always have one of these two anyway, so we'll be able to use those to click and read more. And then underneath it we just have a little bit of more information, which includes the whole list of authors. So instead of just showing the first one here, we're just doing a join with a comma so we can have multiple authors, the book's publisher, as well as the published date. So let's save that and go back to our bookshelf component. And now in here we can create some new state properties, which will be open and set open, which will handle the showing and hiding of the dialogue, as well as the detailed book that we're going to be showing in those dialogues. So when the user fires off handle click open, we'll take in a book and we'll set that details book, then set open to true. Now if I have this set open to true first and this after, then what can actually happen is I might see a flicker of an old book or no book when I first open. So we want to swap these around so that set open happens after I set the details book. And then right at the top of our component rendering here, we'll add this in, which will check if it's open and it has a book then we will show the book details dialog and pass those two values in. So if we just want to see what this does for us right now, let's just add in a quick little button with on click. I'll handle click open and take in this book, and let's just wrap this around the bookshelf card as well and go back to our app. You can see we've got click me on top of all of these. So if I click on this JavaScript one, now I'm presented with this modal. I can click close to close it, and I can click read more, and that will take me to the Google Books page. I can actually view the whole book here. Sometimes it will just show you a quick preview. So that's a pretty cool thing that we can do with those links. Cool. So we're not going to be actually having it in that button there. So let's just remove it from there for now. And the next thing we can do is create the bookshelf card menu, which will start off looking like this, which will take in bookshelf card menu props, take in the book and handle click open. And the bookshelf card menu itself will have these anchor L properties, which we will use with our menu. So this menu is imported from Material UI, and using this anchor L, it will be able to figure out where you've clicked on the screen and where it should open the menu from. So that's what that's for. And then we have a handle click on this icon button here, which uses the more vertical icon. We'll change this to card menu, and the menu itself will be set to open once handle clicked has been clicked on, which will set open to true. And then within this menu, the first item that we're going to have is just a view more, which has a list item icon of the visibility icon. And when we click on handle view more, that's going to do handle click open, which will show the menu to us. So let's go and add this into the book card component. And we're just going to add it in underneath here. So let's import this, and also let's import handle click open as well. And then we can have that in here. If we save that, now we need to also add it into where we're calling the bookshelf card. So handle click open is going to be using the handle click open function. And now if we save that and go back to here, let's just refresh the page. Bookshelf card menu is complaining. I haven't saved this file. If I save the file, I'll come back here. You see we've got this little menu icon now, and if I click it, it pulls up this menu with view more, and I click this, then this comes up now. Cool. So let's continue building out our card menu, and what we'll do is we'll add in another item here for removing the book. So we'll have a menu item with a list item icon and a remove text, and when the user clicks on this, then it's going to actually remove this book from their bookshelf. So in order to do that, we need to import these two values into this component. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll add in handle book and delete book loading, and we'll bring these into the component as well. And then here we'll create a handler for handling delete book click, which will call the handle delete book method with the book ID, and then it will just close down the menu for us afterwards. So now we can use that in the on click, and the whole menu item will be disabled whilst it's loading, and we'll also be showing a tiny little spinner whilst it's loading. Otherwise we'll show the delete icon. So we actually need to create this small loading spinner first. So if we go to the bookshelf style, and here we can create a styled circular progress, and we can just set the max height and max width to 20 pixels. I'm also going to set the color to main here. And now if I go back to the menu, I can import that from the bookshelf style. And we can also import the delete icon from MUI. Now if I save that, I know I'm also going to be needing these two values in the other component, but let's just continue building this component out first, and then we'll go back and add in everything in there later. I also want the user to be able to change which category their book is in from this little menu. So in order to do that, I'm going to create a new component called book status menu item, and within this book status menu item will be a component that takes in the props of current status, which is the book's current status, which is the status that we want to set the book to, handle update book status, which we'll use to update it, and update book is loading, so that we can do the same thing we did on the other one, which is add a loading spinner to the menu item while it's loading. So the menu item is just basically going to have an on click to do the update. It's going to be disabled whilst the update is happening, and the list item icon will be the loading spinner if the current status equals status and the update is happening. And if the current status equals status and the update is not happening, then we'll show the done icon to signify that that's currently selected as the status on that book. We also want to show the status as text. So I'm just going to create a new function here, which will take in the status and switch over it. And for whichever status it is, it's going to put out a readable label for that category. So unread will be to read, reading will just be the same, and if it's read it will say finished. And then we can just add this in here like this, and this should take in status. So let's save that. Now let's go back to the bookshelf card menu. And what we can do here is add some more menu items. The first of which is just going to be a label for the status, just to make it a bit easier for the user to read. And then we will loop over these 3 book statuses. So I'm just creating an array out of them to map over it. And then for each status, we're going to be using one of these book status menu items that we've just created to have that in the menu. So I'm just going to import all of these missing things, but we do still need the handle book status function and the update book loading. So we can import that in like this. Just have an input of update book input, and we can have these 2 in here like this. Let's save that. And then now we just need to create a new handler, which will look like this. Handle update book status will take in status. If the status is the same as the current book status, so if the user just clicks on the same status that it currently is, then it won't close the menu. Otherwise, we'll update the book and then handle close. So let's save that. Now we've got the menu done, we can come back to our bookshelf card and pass in the correct props into this component. First, we need to import these in here. Handle delete book, update book loading, and delete book loading. And then let's just import them in here as well. Sort that out. And then we'll add them to this one. And if we save that, now we are importing all the required things that we need to pass into the menu, and then actually passing it into the menu down here. So if we just copy these and go back to here, let's just replace all of these with the correct properties that we're supposed to pass in. Now if we save that and go back to the browser, we can open this and we can see these are all set to a status of to read. It has view more and remove. We can actually remove them and they should work. So if we click remove and go to network, this was a delete book and it was successful. If we refresh the page, we can see that now that's gone. And we can also change this to reading, and now that's also been removed from this category. It hasn't been deleted, but it's just been moved to another category which we're not currently displaying. So let's go and sort that out and actually show the different categories that we have. To do this, I'm going to create a new component called bookshelf card list.tsx, and this component is going to look like this. It's going to import all of those different things that we were importing into bookshelf card from before, but instead it will be taking in the list of books as well. And we'll be using the use theme hook again to check that if it's a mobile view or not. And if it is mobile, we're going to change the stack direction from column to row. That'll just make it a bit easier to see on the mobile phone. We'll have spacing of 1, padding of 2, and overflow will just be auto. And then we're going to be looping through the books in this component instead, and then rendering the bookshelf card within here, which is basically just putting it in a stack so that it can be displayed nicely within our containers. So I'm just going to save that and then go back to our bookshelf component. And here, instead of having this as unread, the first container I'm going to want at the top is going to actually be the reading ones. So I'm just going to change this to reading, and then I don't need to map over it anymore as we're going to be doing the books inside of it. So I can remove all of this and change this bookshelf card to bookshelf card list. And instead of book, we're going to be taking in books this time. and import this from bookshelf card list. Not book, sorry, I need to actually pass in books.reading. So now if I save this and go back to here, I can see now it's set this to reading and the formatting is looking a little bit nicer. So now I can have is also another bookshelf tabs underneath where I can show the other two categories. So first I'll have unread, and then secondly I'll have the read books. So in here I'll have this as to read, and this will be unread, and then I'll have another tab in this container which will be finished, and this one can be set to read. Now I can go back to my app and you can see I've got these two containers. The first one is reading and the second one is to read, and also I've got a finish tab in here. I'll go back to explore and just add in a few more books, and I add in some random books, and I go back to my bookshelf and to refresh the page. I've got all of these books loading up and I can change them to finished. So now it's in this category, and if I want to change it to reading, it comes up in here, and all of that is happening on the back end as well as the front end. So now let's handle how this loading thing is happening. Obviously we don't want to keep it as just like loading ... Let's add in a skeleton. So we'll create a new file called bookshelf card skeleton, and this is going to be a paper with elevation and some styling on that paper itself. So just some box shadow just to match the original cards that we have, and then we'll have a stack that's aligning all the items in the center with a box of height 150 to mimic the size of the image, and then we'll have two text skeletons underneath with fixed height and width. Now if we go back into the bookshelf card list component, we can then import loading into this component as well, and then within here, instead of rendering books directly, what we'll do is we'll say if it's loading, we'll create a new array with 6 items and map over those, and then we will display a bookshelf card skeleton for each of those items. So if I save that and go to the bookshelf component, I can now remove this line from here and then passing loading into this component. Now if I go back to the app and hit refresh, we should be able to see cards loading up with skeleton rather than loading ... Oops, also need to add in the loading to these components here as well. So now we shouldn't see that error anymore. So let's just reload that. Let's just set this to slow 3G, refresh the page. We can see that these have loading skeletons as well. Doing this, just setting this to true, and then just have them constantly visible whilst you make it look a little bit neater. But we'll just set this back to loading. So there is a couple things I want to address here. So when we created the AppSync API, you might remember me mentioning about this line here where we had a limit that defaulted to 20. So in the case that we have more than 20 books, we actually won't be getting all the data that we need here. Obviously, we can just up the limit as well to a higher number so that we can just load more data anyway. But to make this scalable, we want to add in some pagination with our backend API. So I'm going to show you how we can do that. So if we go into our hooks and go to use bookshelf, let's add in fetch more to this use list books query. And then we're going to create a handler so that we can actually click a button and fetch more items. So those of you that watched the previous video would have seen me do something similar with the Google Books API, where we changed the start index to books.length to get the next set of results. However, in this case, on our AppSync API, we receive a next token when there are more items for us to get. So in this case, we are just going to be passing in the variables, the next token that we get from our data. And then in our update query, we'll look at the previous result and the new result. If there are no more new results, we'll just return the previous results. Otherwise, we'll set the items of both of those results into these two variables. And basically, if the new one has items, then we will create a new array with the previous books and the new books, and then return those combined results to the cache so that we can get an updated version of that in our local cache. We also have to manage the loading state of this ourselves, so import that in. I've gone into a little bit more detail about why we need to do this with the Apollo caching in the last episode. So just go check that out towards the end of that video. I do an example of what happens when we fetch more without having this update query functionality in there and why it's important for us to have it. So in here, we're just going to export the fetch more books and fetching more loading state. Take that back to our bookshelf and have that in here. And then what we want to do is underneath the page title here, we'll create a new loading button, which will import from Miri Lab, have a variant of contained. Whilst it's loading, it will be set to fetching more, and on click, it will fetch more books. So there is a problem right now where this is still being shown even if there are no more books. So if I click load more right now, it's just going to be loading the same thing over and over again, and that's a bug, so we don't want that. What we want to do is disable the button if we can't fetch anymore, and the way to do that, we're just going to create a new variable in here called can fetch more books, which will use memo to look at the data and see if we've got a next token, and if we do have a next token, that means we can get more books. So let's return the can fetch more books from here and import it from the hook, and then we'll say that this button will be disabled if we can't fetch more books. So now this is grayed out. So we can't really prove that this is working right now because we don't have enough books. Let's go and search for something else. Let's do Harry Potter and let's add some books. There is another issue as well where when we add books and navigate back to this page, it doesn't make a new request because Apollo is clever enough to save that data in the cache, and it will prevent us from making multiple requests for data that we already have. But in this case, we do want to be able to get the latest data every time we load this component. So the way we can change that is by going into our use bookshelf hook, and within our options we're going to set the fetch policy to cache and network, which will allow us to use data that's stored in the cache whilst we're on the page, but also use the network to fetch the data again if we reload this component. So now if I go back to explore page and go back to bookshelf, you'll see that it would have loaded up these new books. So let's just go and add in some more books in here. To add this, or I can add on anything at this point. Going back to my bookshelf, these have started loading in. I've still got 13, 14, 15, 16. Let's do Python. Let's just add anything right now. Back to bookshelf. Okay, now we've got 16, 17, 18, 19. We still need more books. Get some other JavaScript books in here. Not the best, but sure. Let's just add them to our bookshelf. Okay. It seems that we have hit some sort of limit. As you can see, it's showing 16 books, 17, 18, 19. Either we have a zero index issue here, or it actually only lets us get 19 objects. Let me just check the list books query. Yeah, no, we're getting 20 books. I think it's because we may have test book. Yeah, that's why. So we have test book in there, and that's not actually being shown in here, so that's why it's not adding up to 20. But now if I click load more, now you can see it's showing 30 books and it's loading even more books. And now load more is disabled because the second query didn't have a next token, and that's because it didn't have 20 items, it only had 15. Cool. I'll move some of these to reading and some of these to finished. So one final thing that I wanted to show, which was regarding the cache again. If we now delete one of these and click remove, we can see that if we go to network, delete book was a hit and it was successful, but the Python for Dummies book is still here. However, if I refresh the page, it's gone, and that's not because I need to load more. Even if I click load more, it's still gone. It's been removed. So what we want to do is when we delete the book, we want to have the latest data showing. So one way of doing this is doing the refetch option on this query, and once you've deleted the book, you could do refetch here. So that means now when I delete one of these books, let's delete this book, everything loads up again, and that book is then removed. I can load more and it still won't come back. But That's not the most optimal way because that's a whole other request that you need to make. So instead of doing that, what we'll do is inside the user book mutation arguments, we'll add in this update cache here. So what this will do is it will take the cache and the data that we get back from our API, and if there's no delete book in our data, we will just exit and return. But if there is, then we will use cache.identify delete book, which will basically give us the normalized ID of that book in the cache. And this is what the ID is, so one of these IDs, and then we can evict them from the cache and do the garbage collection, which is just what you have to do to remove it and clear it. And if we save that, then what we can now have is, instead of making that second query where we did a deletion followed by listing the books, we can just have a nice and easy experience for the user where we remove the book and the book gets removed from the cache, so it gets removed from the UI, but only one request is made. That makes both the user experience nice and clean, but also keeps your app performing just a little bit better. And that is it for the video. We've finished building our bookshelf app, all the way from being able to create an account to signing in with a fully functional authentication system. And within our application, we have an explore page where we're able to search for different books, add them to our bookshelf, and then in our bookshelf manage them by having them in different categories: reading, to read, and finished. I encourage you to build on what we've already built to increase your knowledge further. You should have picked up some good skills in this course, but having a play around with the architecture and the code base and trying new things are a great way to expand your skill set. This is also what the app looks like on mobile view. Go to the explore page. We can also view things in mobile format. If you made it to the end of this course, then I'd love to know your opinions on it. Tell me what you liked about it and tell me what I can do better in future videos. And if you learned anything from me, then I'd really appreciate a like and a subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.